Hello, my name is Elizabeth Timmons, and this is an interview I conducted with Donald Merritt, who is the curator of Chung, which is located in John Day. My thanks to him for doing this interview, which is about the history of the Chinese community in John Day, as well as the history of Chung itself, which you'll get to hear a little bit more about in just a moment, as well as traditional Chinese medicine and the sort of integration into modern society today. So I hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening. All right. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what Chung is.
Okay.
And to my knowledge, I've been there a couple times before, but it was a Chinese-owned grocery, dry goods store, and a apothecary, a clinic in John Day, and it was built in the mid to late 1800s. I'm looking at an article now that says 1866 to 67. And then it was owned and operated through the 1940s, at which point it was boarded up in, I want to say 1955, and then it wasn't opened again until 1975. So it's a time capsule in a sense.
Correct. And generally the information it has is okay. Over the last several years, we've been doing a lot more work in our archives, and so we've got a lot of the dates a little bit more better pinned down.
Fantastic.
And so what we're thinking is that the building was constructed in about 1865 to 1866, so a little bit earlier.
Okay.
And Dot K or Ing Dot K and Lung An purchased it in 1887. And then they started running it as both a general store and an apothecary, basically from that time on, from late 1887 through until 1940 when Lung An passed away. And what we have discovered is that Lung An and Dot K both actually ran the businesses then. And they were very successful, and we believe that they were probably the two of the top richest men in John Day by the 1930s.
That's amazing. I've heard that Lung An especially was a very astute businessman.
He was. In fact, we found records just over the wintertime that he owned numerous properties, not just around John Day, but also in Portland, near Goose Bay. He had land almost on the ocean. He owned a warehouse dock where they ship supplies into, which we found that out. And he even owned land up in the Long Creek area, and he leased it to timber companies, so he made money off timber sales.
That's
on top
amazing.
of everything else he was doing.
Yeah, that's a very diverse portfolio there.
It certainly is. A lot more than what anyone thought, for sure.
So sort of with bearing in mind what Chung is and what our project is mostly focusing on, which is the current we're doing a community health assessment focusing mostly on Portland, Chinatown, but the Oregon area, Chinese American population.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking into the history of that, and we're especially focusing on traditional Chinese medicine.
Okay.
And so I wanted to ask what the importance of having a traditional Chinese medicinal apothecary for immigrants was in John Day historically.
Okay. So stepping back a little bit with that, we actually had at least one other Chinese doctor, maybe two, prior to Dot K coming on board in the 1888. And so there was actually another Chinese doctor that we're not sure if he ran out of Chung. We think so, but we can't prove it. So there was actually Chinese doctors here probably going back to when the first Chinese were in the area in the early 1860s. And so for the Chinese miners, it was very critical to have traditional Chinese medicine doctors because that's what they were used to.
Yeah.
And we believe that they actually would grow certain herbs and plants that they brought over from China locally, such as opium and other things of that variety, so they can actually use it for medicine. And so when Doc K arrived, there was kind of already an established presence, but we're finding that there was more non-Chinese visiting Doc K even prior to the Chinese leaving. Because there was starting to get a reputation that Chinese doctors probably knew something a little bit more than Western doctors, which wasn't very much in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And so by 1910, the Chinese doctors were pretty much gone except for Doc K. But the local residents was really getting intrigued with what Doc K was doing, particularly after 1918 when the Spanish flu influenza hit.
That's fantastic because I had a follow-up question specifically about the Spanish flu.
Okay. So,
and I was going to ask, because you're right, in 1918, Grant County experienced 1,000 cases of the Spanish flu. It was a big deal, and I was wondering how that affected the community around Chung.
Sure. So, going with his story a little bit more with it, is that what they were doing is they were building a road into the area so they can start transporting goods from the valley and do trading. And the workers were starting to get sick, and the company was like, well, we're going to be losing a lot of men because of this, a lot of local workers. And Doc Hay heard about it, fixed up a batch of medicine, took it out, and everyone drank out of it. And hardly anyone missed a day of work because of the influenza. And once that happened, word got spread that this China doctor really knew how to treat medicine. They still got sick, but not. We don't know if anyone that passed away from the influenza outbreak, which was kind of unusual. So certainly Doc K knew something that was going on. And once that happened, he really got his reputation, and that's really when he started making a name for himself as a real doctor for the area.
That's amazing. The Spanish flu killed, I want to say, 125 people in Grant County, and certainly many were sick during the time. So that's a huge, I would say, victory for Hay.
I would say so, because is everything that we came across in oral histories that we conducted, that people that knew about it, they also, that they may have gotten sick, but not so much they actually lost a day of work. So they didn't even lose days of work because of it. So that just kind of goes to show, like, they knew something that other doctors did not at the time, which we think they still do.
And that's something I wanted to ask about as well, is sort of looking back at history and the treatment of the Spanish flu. How does this response relate to the current response surrounding COVID-19, do you think?
Well, with all my contacts, I know with Chinese professionals, Chinese themselves, we are, I don't know if you heard, but been working with Chinese professors from China, Beijing, Taiwan, and they are doing a documentary on traditional Chinese medicine in the world. And they came to Chung and filmed for a while, and they looked at some of our stuff. And everyone agrees, like, we think that probably if we had access, we probably could have adapted some of the influenza formulas for this outbreak that we're having currently. So who knows if we actually may have had the potential for a vaccine right here that we have all the ingredients for right here in the building here in John Day, and no one even realizing it. That's where we're at with it.
That's absolutely incredible.
And once we start working to get the Chinese herbs and medical formulas translated so we can actually understand what we have. I bet you if we go back through there would be hints of what ingredients does this for the symptoms and help with all that. So that was my first thought when this all hit, and they're trying to find vaccines. I said, I bet you there's a cure right here, and no one even knows it.
That's the problem with history, is too often it's forgotten too quickly, and then by the time you figure it out,
yep,
it repeats itself. So, but
exactly,
this is that's absolutely incredible. I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the hurdles that Lung On and is it Inghe?
Inghe, yes.
Inghe, okay. Thank you. Some of the hurdles they had to navigate as the proprietors of Kemwa Chung.
Sure. So you almost have to kind of tell the information both with them together and individually. Mm-hmm. So, like with Lung On, he not only ran the general store, but he ran numerous other businesses, had other properties. Of course, he had the first car dealership in Eastern Oregon. And so he had his hands into a lot of things, including Chinese laborers. And so if anyone needed work done, people would go to Lung On, said, hey, I need workers for a project or for the summer or whatever the case, and he would go out and recruit them. So on that business, he was pretty good. And then, but there were a few in the community, they never really got really rowdy, but they didn't like a lot of the Chinese taking over the jobs. And so they would try to find some way to get Lung On and Dak Hay either arrested or kicked out of the community, whatever the case may be, to get them out of there. And one of the things that they tried to do was say, well, opium. Okay, we don't allow any opium smoking, or we don't want it here. And so they actually got raided several times for having opium. The problem was, it was 3 years before they actually passed a law on that. So they were actually raided even though it was still legal to possess and use opium. So that was one hurdle that they would have to go through. And they were both arrested, and 3 separate times, and each time the case was thrown out. And the last time the judge says, we don't bring this up again. We do not want to lose our town doctor and our other Chinese folks because of this. He's our town doctor. We don't want to lose him. And so they actually had a lot of community support for them to stay here. And 3 separate times, Doc Hay himself was arrested for practicing medicine. Because they said, you're practicing without a license, you shouldn't be a doctor, and the same thing. 3 separate times, it was thrown out 3 separate times. So they went through a lot.
To have such a good judge.
Well, it is, and because they did not get along with the town sheriff. The town sheriff was the one that was causing most of the problems. He just didn't like Chinese, and he did not want them here. And probably because the Lung On and Dak Hay had more influence over the town than he did. And we feel that he probably was a little bit annoyed with that.
To put it mildly.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever arrested somebody up to 6 times because I've been annoyed.
Right. Yeah, you don't hear that much anymore.
Yeah, but it did happen.
It did happen.
And to that degree, to what degree do you think the Chinese community really integrated with other communities in John Day? And
I think,
was there a desire to integrate?
I think, particularly with Lung On and Dak Hay, yes, they wanted to integrate because they adapted their dress, their customs, even though they kept a lot of their traditional Chinese viewpoints as well. But as far as other Chinese in the area, we don't have a lot, but what we do have, it shows that they wanted to be a part of this too. A lot of them cut off their what they call the coolies, the braid that they had running down, which was traditional. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them removed that to adapt to Western society. And a lot of the people, like a couple of names that I have is like Buckaroo Sam and Marquis Tom.
Mm-hmm.
They were two Chinese that were probably better known than anyone else outside Dot K and Langan. And they went around and worked at ranches. In fact, Marquis Tom was a sheep herder, and the owner of the sheep ranch, he made him a foreman. And so a lot of the community really supported the Chinese and helped them integrate into that, and they would help them raise money so they can travel between John Day to Long Creek or Sumter or even towns that are no longer in existence. So they were adapting into it pretty well. There's very few of them that did not, because once they got here, they pretty much stayed here, particularly the ones after 1910. They made John Day their home and pretty much never left.
So then to add on to that, it seems like the desire to integrate very much was there, but talking about the sheriff, and I seem to remember the last time that I was there was a Chinese section of town. It was separate
Yes.
from the main portion of town. And so my questions are, what were some of the challenges faced by them, and some of the challenges to really integrating and being part of the other communities?
Sure. So what we are kind of learning is that when the Chinese actually moved over here to John Day from Canyon City, it made it where the Chinatown is right now. It used to be basically the swampy area, the place that no one wanted to build houses. So that's where they forced the Chinese to really settle. And so that was one case with that. And then after they got established, people pretty much ignored going into Chinatown because they did not want to, they felt uncomfortable going into Chinatown itself. Mm-hmm. And even though they were welcomed into the community to work and everything, they still felt that the Chinese should still be separate from the rest of the community. But that kind of changed a little bit over time, particularly after Dot K started getting a reputation. So a lot more non-Chinese started going into Chinatown, and they found out, like, hey, there's laundries in here. There's other stores and businesses that we believe that they were actually accessing. And one of the best cases is that other bars, saloons, gambling establishments, they would close like maybe at 10, 12 o'clock at night. Well, they didn't want to go home, so they went over to Chinatown because they would gamble all night long.
Uh-huh.
And so they would go into those kind of places, and that's where they would intermingle with all the Chinese, and so there was a separation, but it was not as bad as other areas in the nation. There's a lot more tolerance for them.
And a big part of that comes from Inghei's treatment, sort of bridging that gap and starting that bridge, and then
Correct.
From there.
Yeah, that was one big part of it. And then with Langan, because he could speak and write English very well, and so he was what we call the China boss. He was the liaison between the Chinese and the non-Chinese. So if anything would come up, they would always go to Langan. He was really the Chinese leader and became very prominent in the community because of that in general.
I'd imagine so, especially being such an astute businessman and having an eye for these sorts of things. Being able to be a community leader fits the bill. Right.
So going back to your question about the Chinatown and all that, every story that I hear, oral interviews that we have, and there are people that talk about it or knew the Chinese, always taught very well of the Chinese being very friendly and never causing any problems. And so I think the community respected that, and that's why most of the time it was very peaceful, even though once in a while ranchers or something like that would get kind of rowdy and shoot up Chinatown. But that was more rare than common.
Well, that's a relief.
Um, it's difficult because you can't look at history through a contemporary lens.
Right.
But hearing about these sorts of things, it is difficult to think about, especially in the climate that we have going on right now with our Black Lives Matter movement
Right.
and the undertones of racism in society today.
Right. So yeah, so when you're hearing these kind of stories, like with the Chinese and how it relates to current events and everything else going on, it's like there's a lot more of that side of the story that hasn't been told, but it's slowly starting to come out. And I hope it continues that trend for a long time.
Me as well. I had just a couple of last questions, and I think we've covered them pretty well, but I just want to iterate. I wanted to ask how integral Chung and traditional Chinese medicine were to healthcare and healthcare access for Chinese Americans. Obviously, the healthcare system in the 1800s to early 1900s is not the same as what we have today.
Right.
But sort of looking at the history of healthcare access.
Yeah, so from what we can tell, is that Doc K in particular never refused any kind of treatments. And so if he would even diagnose and send off medications, even he doesn't just use, let me step back, he actually did not just use traditional Chinese medicine. He also used modern day medicine. He was very astute in keeping up with the current trends of medicine in America. We have medicine books, encyclopedias that we think someone read it to him, but he kept up with all the latest innovations in medicine. So, because there's a lot of modern medicine at his disposal that we have at Chung. And also minor surgeries. And we just learned a year or so ago that he seemed to have been also practicing acupuncture. And so people that need to come in and have that done, he was also able to do that. And everything that we found is that it's always been by word of mouth. He never really advertised. Langan did. With the different flyers that he's a medicine doctor, and if there's treatment to come and see him. But as far as Doc K, he just treated anyone that came in, and he would send out prescriptions and medications and instructions on how to make it if he couldn't not do that. And because we have letters going as far away as Massachusetts for people wanting to be treated by Doc K.
That's amazing.
And we have a map, and he practiced medicine all across the country, Texas, South Dakota, Nevada. And so people that heard about him, they did try to contact him. We even have other Chinese doctors in San Francisco and Portland write to Doc K wondering how to treat a particular ailment because they did not know how to do that.
So he was really a jack of all trades, if you will. He used a very integrated medicinal practice.
Yes.
And whatever worked the best for what was at hand.
Right.
To do that.
Right. And that what blew me away is that he wasn't ignoring modern medicine at the time. He was still using it, but he was also using the modern stuff. And right, and it's just amazing how much he actually knew, how smart he really was. He didn't just practice medicine; he did research too into it and applied it. And he even quarantined folks here in town if there was a disease he thought might be infectious. So he would actually quarantine a house.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that he would treat whoever came in through his door. One of the barriers for a lot of people for getting treatment now is, of course, money and healthcare. Was that a barrier then as well?
Not so much. because we have we have dozens and dozens of checks that they gave to Doc Hay. Because in a trunk, they found $23,000 worth of uncashed checks. And they were mostly from patients of Doc Hay. And this was mainly in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And so when people ask, like, well, how come he never cashed the checks? He says, I don't need the money. They do. So if they paid with a check, he just never cashed it.
So if they weren't able to pay at the time, they would still get their treatment. And then if he didn't think that they had the money to pay him, period, he wouldn't accept payment for his treatments.
Correct. And they would also barter sometimes. Or they would trade for your services, I'll give you a bushel of apples or potatoes. And so they would actually trade for their services as well.
Well, that makes sort of sense in today's society in a way because, of course, hospitals don't turn away patients.
Right.
Currently. But I've also never known a hospital to not cash the check at the end of it.
Yeah, and so that's kind of a significant part of the story is that, so we don't know, because there's several of them checks in there that it was the same patient that would come back for visits and pay for a check, and it was not cash. So they knew that the money was not leaving the bank.
But they would still pay with a check anyway.
They would still try to pay with a check. And because of Chinese culture, Doc Hay would still accept it. He wouldn't refuse. He said, well, okay, I will receive it as reciprocation for my services, but he felt he didn't need the money, so he just never cashed it because they needed it.
I think a lot of that, too, has to do with being community leaders and being entrenched in the community, because then, of course, you care about the community and you know when certain people can't afford medical bills or it's in your best interest to help out your community.
Right. And there's one little thing, we think it's a Lung On issue, but there is a sign above the general store that says, trying to remember exactly how it's phrased, but it's basically to the effect of medicine treatments must be paid in cash. And so we think that's more of a Lung On thing, wanting to make money, while Doc Hay is like, no, they don't have to pay because they don't have the money.
Let me ask, did they butt heads often because of this? Because it seems like Lung On was a very savvy businessman who really was focused on profits, his community as well, but he definitely has this air of this very savvy businessman, whereas Inhe seems like the person just interested in the health of his community and doing research for healthcare for future communities. And those goals don't always coincide, of course. No,
and we do have evidence in personal stories that, yes, it's true that Lung On, they were the best of friends, but on occasion they did kind of rub each other the wrong way, and a lot of it has to do with money, because sometimes with Lung On, with his gambling, he would go out and gamble a lot, and sometimes Doc Hay would go out to buy something, get money out of the bank, and there's no money in the bank because Lung On gambled it all away. And so there has been some few arguments apparently because of Lung On using up all the money.
So not only is he very good at making money, but he's also very good at spending it.
Yes. Fortunately, he made more than he spent. But, yeah, on occasion, they would do that.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me today and taking this time out of your schedule.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to have any of the results of what you find here and access to the website, I think it's all going to be very important in the near future for everything that we're trying to do here as well. So yeah, any information that you can share with me, that would be wonderful.